Hey, good morning. My name is Wendy Block, and I'm Vice President of Business Advocacy and Member Engagement with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for joining us today for this Listen to My Business press call on the Biden administration's COVID-19 vaccine or testing emergency temporary standard for businesses with 100 or more workers. A lot has happened since the Listen to My Business Coalition was launched on October 18 in response to the Biden administration's announcement that it would seek a mandate and bypass the traditional rulemaking process, which also allowed them to bypass the need for public comment and input. The Listen to My Business Coalition was launched to give Michigan businesses an avenue to make their voices heard in Washington, D.C. regarding the unintended consequences of this federal mandate. Late last week, as many of you know, our fears were validated when the 490-page emergency temporary standard document was released by OSHA. It's large, it's complicated, it's burdensome, and has repercussions for employers and employees alike. Frankly, it impacts more employers than previously expected. 13 pages of the 490-page document were dedicated to explaining how you count to 100 and meet the minimum thresholds under which you must comply. 13 pages. It's only the federal government that could make math this difficult. The ETS comes with two compliance deadlines, December 5 and January 4, dates that are just around the corner and are going to be difficult for many employers during an already busy holiday season and amidst a severe supply chain crisis. The ETS was released on November 5 and took effect immediately, but was stayed a day later by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. To date, lawsuits challenging the ETS have been filed in 6 different circuit courts of the U.S. Court of Appeals. In issuing their stay of the vaccine mandate, the judges from the Fifth Circuit stated petitions give cause to believe that there are grave statutory and constitutional issues with the mandate. The panel ordered the U.S. Department of Labor to respond to the petitioner's motion for a permanent injunction to the mandate by the close of business yesterday, and petitioners will have until November 9 to file their reply. So although the stay means that employers do not have to comply with its terms, for now, we fear the stay could be lifted by the Fifth Circuit or a circuit court that gets the consolidated cases for review. As such, this coalition will continue to voice its concerns about this unprecedented mandate and continue to ask the Biden administration to reconsider. We will also be submitting public comment to OSHA via the mandatory 30-day comment period window that opened last week. With that, I'm going to turn things over to other members of the coalition. Beginning today is Andy Johnson, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Grand Rapids Area Chamber of Commerce. Also, as a final note, we will be taking questions from you as we near kind of the close of this call. So please raise your hand using that feature in the chat box or in the Zoom feature, and John Selleck will facilitate that towards the end. Andy, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. As Wendy mentioned, after 2 months of waiting and wondering, we got what we expected, and that's the broadest and most far-reaching mandate that OSHA has ever put forward in the history of the agency. And as we're going to talk about more today, this is a complicated mandate. I think it's important to point out that it was put forward as an emergency rule 20 months into this pandemic. And what it's going to do is it's going to put job providers in this incredibly difficult position as they're already working to manage significant talent and supply chain issues during a hectic fourth quarter. While we object to this government mandate on free enterprise, we're going to work to help our employers and employees through this. And we call on state and federal regulators to be flexible and apply common sense whenever possible, especially as these deadlines are rapidly approaching. And I know our members are already spending a lot of time working through this, even with the stay that was granted by the courts. They're spending a ton of man hours trying to understand this and figure out how it's going to apply to their unique work environment. We have to stress that, again, the vaccines themselves are miracles of modern medicine, American ingenuity, and Michigan, what we're able to accomplish. But with the conflict that this mandate causes, we're really concerned about what's going to happen in the workplace and worry that, in fact, it may increase vaccine hesitancy in some areas. And we're going to find out whether this OSHA mandate is unconstitutional or not as it works its way forward, and hope that the president and administration take a long look at this, and hopefully they choose to reverse course. I know a lot is being made about January 4, but want to stress the December 5 mandate is also going to be significant for businesses as well. That's when the mask policy goes into effect for unvaccinated employees at employers over 100 and more, as well as a host of other requirements that'll happen on December 5. So after 2 months of waiting, and given this time of year, it's hard not to feel like Ralphie in A Christmas Story in his pink bunny suit. We knew Aunt Clara was sending us something. We had no input as to what it was going to be, and now we're going to be forced to wear it. And not just when Aunt Clara comes to visit. The concern with this mandate is that it could be amended, extended, or expanded, and in fact made permanent as this goes forward. So that's why we're here to voice these concerns, and while we will be weighing informally through the comment process with OSHA. Now I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Henry Wolf with the Northern Michigan Chamber Alliance. Henry?
Thank you, Andy. Again, my name is Henry Wolf, the Director of Government Relations for the Northern Michigan Chamber Alliance, representing over 16 chambers of commerce from across Northern Michigan, including Alpena, Benzie, Cadillac, Charlevoix, Gaylord, Marquette, Manistee, Petoskey, and Traverse City. And employers across Northern Michigan are in a perilous position once again due to the possibility of having to implement this mandate. And the message they've sent to me is clear and simple. They are pro-vaccine and anti-mandate. So I've inquired to our U.S. senators about actions that they may take to protect these desperate employers, and would encourage them to support a referendum on this mandate through the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to block federal rules. I would encourage employers and employees alike to make their voices heard and ask legislators to support a referendum on the mandate through the Congressional Review Act. We have to have some sort of check on this rule, not a rubber stamp. And until we have more guidance from the courts, like Andy said, we'll be doing the best that we can to help employers navigate the mandate. And next we have Rich Studley from the Michigan Chamber to add some more.
Thank you, Henry. Good morning to those who have joined us on the call, and thank you to friends and colleagues who are participating in the Listen to My Business campaign. The Chambers of Commerce and Trade and Professional Associations who are part of this coalition represent over 1 million employees employed by employers throughout the state, companies of every size and type. You'll recall that several weeks ago, this coalition respectfully requested that President Biden hit the pause button, that he stop and go through the traditional rulemaking process at the U.S. Department of Labor. Again, we are extremely disappointed that President Biden and the U.S. Department of Labor chose to exclude every employer and every employee in Michigan from having reasonable or fair prior notice of these regulations. Just 2 days after the November election, the president, through the U.S. Department of Labor, issued 490 pages of federal regulations with excruciating details, as Wendy indicated earlier, 13 pages of federal regulations on how to count to 100. Bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. refer to the president's unilateral federal COVID mandate as an ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard. We know now, from having a week to look at the details and specifics and listen to the concerns that have been expressed by business leaders across the state, that ETS in Michigan stands for excessive, time-consuming, and short-sighted. Just 12 hours ago, it was reported that Michigan and America's pharmaceutical research and manufacturing companies may soon apply to the FDA for emergency approval of a pill that will be substantially effective in fighting COVID. And so now we could add to ETS and O for the very real likelihood that about the time this regulation takes effect, the change in the fight of COVID-19 will occur, and this vaccine mandate could be obsolete. This is especially problematic in Michigan, where throughout the past 18 months or 2 years in our state's fight against COVID-19, private businesses have never been a significant, major, or ongoing source of COVID outbreaks. So this rule is misguided from the beginning, and we remain gravely concerned about the serious statutory and constitutional questions that have been raised. So next up is James Reed, and James, please continue.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm James Reed, a lawyer at Dinsmore and Scholl, and I also serve as the director of Michigan SHRM, which is a resource that oversees the 19 human resource chapters throughout all of Michigan. And I'm seeing some surveys from SHRM that are identifying major disruption in the workplace trying to comply with this mandate. Based on a recent survey, 90% believe it will be very challenging to implement any type of testing or mandate policies, and 80% are concerned about the amount of time they're going to have to spend and devote to enforcing or tracking employees' vaccination status and or test results. And from a legal perspective, we're getting many questions throughout the country about what to do given the current injunction, and how do we navigate enforceability. And unfortunately, we can't just wait to see the final outcome of how it works out in the litigation process. If this becomes implemented, there's not going to be an extra period of time, most likely, to be in compliance. So in order to avoid up to a $14,000 per violation fine, we're recommending that companies still are prepared to have a plan in place that, at a minimum, identifies how are you going to learn your employees' vaccination status, and are you going to, allow employees to self-test? Who's going to verify those tests? What is your plan to track and implement? And how are you going to prepare for various, OSHA complaints that are likely to happen? I have a lot of HR professionals telling me they're highly concerned about the morale and engagement in the workplace with all of this going on. And there's going to be a stronger push than ever to have more remote work to the extent companies are able to provide that. And that could make it more challenging for employers to get employees back to the physical site if that is what they are ideally looking to do. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Wendy.
Our final speaker today is Michael Tierney. Michael is the president and CEO of the Community Bankers of Michigan. Michael?
Thank you, Wendy. Well, the Community Bankers of Michigan represents the banks in the state of Michigan. There are 80 today, and we also represent 140 companies that work with the banks. So companies like CPA firms, attorneys, and IT providers, anyone that wants to work with the bank. The bankers came to work every day last year during COVID to serve their clients. Many of them kept their branches open. Some went to drive-in only, but there were no vaccines, and we came to work every day to support the residents of the state of Michigan. We also put out $24 billion in PPP funds, covering over 70% of the small business payroll of the state. So these small businesses across our state could stay in business. And the thank you to all of our essential workers is that we now have to deal with the vaccine mandate. We are 100% supportive of vaccines. Over 70% of the staff in banks across the state have been vaccinated. In some banks, it's over 80%. But there are some of our banks, particularly in some of our more rural areas, where they've had a more difficult time getting their people vaccinated. They also face a unique challenge in remote work in the rural areas, and that is there is no broadband service. You can't even get a cell phone signal in some parts of Michigan where we actually have some community banks. And they are the only financial institution that serves those communities in many cases across the state of Michigan. You won't find the big banks in the northern parts of Michigan or in the Upper Peninsula. It's a community bank that's providing the services there. So we had them all on a statewide conference call yesterday, and one of the issues that we've identified for them in trying to comply with this mandate is the whole concept of the capacity of testing. I happen to have a relative that owns a testing lab here in Michigan, and they have a number of major employers. And they have a steady business, right, of serving hospitals and doctors' offices, and they can expand their testing capacity. Hopefully we're going to be able to get them to service the banks in the state. But it's my brother's lab. If it wasn't my brother's lab, they might not be getting serviced. So there is, Rich was telling us yesterday that there's a study that's out that says that the testing is about 250,000 tests a day. It's going to have to ramp up to over 1 million. Well, the government, just like when they announced the PPP program, on one Friday, Steve Mnuchin said you're going to be able to go into your bank next Friday and get a PPP loan. Well, the Small Business Administration didn't know anything about it. The banks didn't know anything about it. And this feels just like it again. We ramped it up fast. We'll ramp this up fast. But there's a major testing issue that has to be addressed in our state, and our state government and our federal government needs to be part of addressing that. Then the last point is we're all facing a labor shortage right now. Banks are no different. And unfortunately, this is going to exasperate that situation. And it's pretty typical that when you get past the holidays that you get some surprise retirement announcements. They're going to come in droves this year because of this mandate. And again, this couldn't come at a worse time when most of our businesses are in their busiest part of the year. Retailers, 40 to 50% of their business is taking place over the next couple of months. Banks get very busy at the end of the year too, and we're having to deal with this at the worst possible time. So those are some of the issues that our industry faces with this mandate.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I'm going to turn things over now to John Selleck. John is going to help facilitate questions from our audience, from the press. And if you would like to ask a question of any of our panelists, please raise your hand in the chat box, or I don't know, using that feature.
First up, we're going to have Dave Eggert from the Associated Press. Go ahead, Dave.
Hi, thanks for doing the call. I was wondering if somebody could explain the rule, how you read it. It sounds like a company could decide to mandate vaccines, or if it wants, it could allow the weekly testing. Is that how you read it? And if so, do you think, given some of the challenges you mentioned with testing supplies, do you think many companies will go the vaccine route as opposed to allowing testing?
I could probably try to take that. So yes, so there's kind of a few options here, right? So you could go the route of just saying we are going to mandate the vaccine straight up, like is required for federal contractors and federal employees with really no alternative for testing. The other option would be either an employee chooses to get vaccinated, or they can choose to submit to weekly testing and wear a mask when at work, when in the office. At this point, what we're hearing from our members is that they're really looking at the dual option, with testing being the alternative. But of course, there are a lot of logistical questions about the availability of tests, how that will work at the work site or sending someone off site to get tested, and what that means if the employee shows up on Monday morning, if they don't have a test result in hand. Really significant concerns about workplace disruptions that could result from that may cause that employer to reconsider their policy. But it does seem at this point that the majority of employers are looking at allowing employees to pursue that testing alternative strategy.
And I'd like to add, even if you have the vaccine mandate, you still have to be prepared to analyze religious and disability accommodations. And a reasonable accommodation could be allowing the testing or a mask in the workplace potentially, and evaluating what is a real religion, sincerely held religious belief, and evaluating what is a disability is very complex and very fact specific. And it's not just a standard, what we believe to be a normal disability or religion. It can be very broad and specific.
Great point, James. Thank you.
Dave, another concern that has come forward is that there are some home tests available for initial or preliminary analysis. And it looks as though in the federal regulations, unless those home tests are taken in the presence of a supervisor or someone from management or an HR professional, those preliminary indications would not qualify as a verified test under the federal regulation. So again, you're pushed back into a more costly, more expensive system with delays, with time off, with paid leave. What happens if an employee initially tests positive for COVID? Are they to be quarantined? Are they to be sent home? Are they allowed to work individually? And then a second test shows that they did not have COVID. So again, part of the challenge is, and it's not a small point, somehow the administration imagines that it'll be easier to wait until January for the effective date of this standard. But for many of our members in hospitality, in travel, tourism, and in retail, the three busiest weeks of the year are Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. There are also ongoing supply chain disruptions in manufacturing. So employers are already challenged with supply chain problems, a labor shortage, and other difficulties during the holiday season. Again, it seems like those who promulgated this rule, I'm sure many of our members would share with you, this rule can't have been written by people who have ever owned or operated a business, especially one that needs to serve its customers during a busy holiday season. That would include transportation and logistics as well. So the timing of implementing this rule really couldn't be worse. It's not easier, it couldn't be worse.
All right, thanks, Rich. With that, we're going to hear from Courtney Bennett at WEYI. Go ahead, Courtney.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So during the Department of Labor call last week, they announced this mandate. They mentioned one of the reasons why was because there's high spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. Are you guys seeing this in Michigan businesses across the state?
Courtney, the short answer to your question is no. That claim by U.S. Department of Labor or other federal officials may apply to Maine or Mississippi or Montana or Missouri. That has not been the case over the past 12 to 18 months in Michigan. Private sector businesses have not been a significant, ongoing, or major source of COVID outbreaks. The vast majority of COVID outbreaks in Michigan have related to older individuals in senior citizen or extensive care facilities, or young people who are of school age. Neither of these groups are a major part of the private sector workplace in Michigan. And in fact, if there's one thing that all of our members from all of the local chambers and trade associations that are part of the coalition have learned over the past year, as Mike indicated, it's how to operate safely and protect our employees and customers. 490 pages of federal regulations were not necessary to tell Michigan's job providers how to reopen safely. Another major concern is, we all know from experience, nothing's quite as permanent as a temporary federal program. The idea that this emergency rule is already under consideration to be permanent is frankly just an outrageously bad. Fight against COVID changes daily and weekly, not in 6-month increments where everything can be frozen in time, waiting for an inspector to come tell you what to do and how to do it.
All right, thanks. We're going to now go to Adrian Roberts from the Detroit Free Press. Go ahead, Adrian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for doing the call. I'm just curious. It sounds like you do expect this rule to go into effect. Are there one or two things that you would like to see that would make this more palatable or easier for businesses? Would you like to see the dates extended? I'm just curious, like, how do you move forward from this point?
Adrian, on behalf of the Michigan Chamber, I would respond by indicating it's not at all clear that the federal rule will take effect. But as Henry Wolf indicated earlier and James Reed has indicated, employers don't have the option to wait and see what happens. This issue, we wouldn't be surprised, works its way from federal appeals courts all the way to the US Supreme Court. Typically, that's a process that takes months, sometimes even years. And so the challenge we all face right now is uncertainty. Regulatory uncertainty is a jobs killer. We don't know what to tell our members to do. Wait and see, doesn't seem responsible. Prepare now for a rule that may never take effect or be dramatically changed. That's why, Adrian, we were respectful but so courteous in asking the president to go through the traditional OSHA rulemaking process, where every employee and employer in Michigan would have the opportunity and fair notice to review the rule, to ask questions and provide comments. The entire business community and every employee in Michigan was excluded from that opportunity to make a problematic rule better and more efficient and more effective. It seems like an all or none proposition, not right at the present time, which is extremely unfortunate and could have been avoided.
All right, thanks, Adrian. Next up, we have Lindsay Moore from MLab. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Hi, so when this coalition first met and was created, you all mentioned that at this point you weren't willing or saw it necessary to get involved in this legal fight. Now that we have seen several lawsuits come to fruition, and as you've all mentioned, that will, kind of determine how to advise members. Are you reconsidering that position at all? Is it time for Michigan to take a legal stance, or what are kind of the pros and cons of doing that at this point?
So at this point, 6 lawsuits have been filed in 6 different jurisdictions. So there's plenty of litigation out there fighting back against this mandate. At this point, we do not plan to file suit. We believe that many of the arguments have already been made in the lawsuits that have been filed, and are actively monitoring and watching to see what will happen when these cases do get consolidated.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions for the panel before we let you guys go? Yep, we got a couple more here. Let's see. Dave Eggert from AP, you're back.
Thanks. This is probably a follow-up for Wendy or James, but anybody could take it. You mentioned that it seemed like the majority of companies are probably going to go with the option where there would be they could allow employees to have testing. Why do you think that is? Is the concern that basically mandatory vaccines you would lose workers? I was just wondering what that calculus is.
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly, just because we covered this quite a bit yesterday with our members. One of the things, Dave, is that because of the employee shortage that everybody faces today, that I think, in a different environment, employers might be a little less willing to pay for testing than they are right now. I do think many of the banks will end up paying for the testing for their employees who are not going to provide proof of vaccination because they're really fearful that they won't be able to find. Well, first of all, you don't want to lose a valuable employee, right? And then very fearful that if they're forced and the employee decides that, well, they're leaving their job rather than getting vaccinated, they're very fearful that they won't be able to find somebody to replace that person. So we're just in a very difficult time for all the reasons that we've talked about. And, it's really unfortunate. If the government wanted to force every American citizen to get vaccinated, why didn't they just go put a mandate in place on the citizens? Well, we all know, right? They're voters, so they want to do it. So instead, they're putting the burden on the employers, and they're driving a wedge between employers and their employees that should not be driven. This is a bad way to implement.
And to Michael's point, I mean, the conversations we hear from members about what they're having to talk about in the workplace with their employees is incredibly difficult. People are under a lot of stress. There's a lot of tough conversations. And as Michael's saying, the government has decided to put employers right in the middle of that divisiveness. And again, as I mentioned, I'm concerned this is going to create some more hesitancy. What we hear from members is that as much as you explain that this is a federal mandate, it's still Andy Johnston Company making me do this. And as much as you try to, say that we're trying to just comply with a mandate, and that creates a very difficult working environment. So I think that's why we're going to see the testing option as just any way to try to keep talent, to try to give people the different options. And as Rich points out, there's going to be more options when it comes to fighting COVID as this continues to evolve and we get to learn more.
And I'd like to add the SHRM survey that I included the link in the chat gives more detail and background. But basically, my personal take is that companies that wanted to mandate it likely already did. So that's why I think there's more companies that are not going to mandate it if they don't have to going forward.
All right, thanks, James. We've got another question from Brianna Noble at the Detroit News. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thanks for holding the panel. Appreciate it. I was just wondering, obviously this mandate is coming from a place where the government feels that there needs to be action taken in order to curb the increasing cases of COVID-19. I mean, is there an alternative that this coalition would like to see instead of this employer mandate for the vaccine or testing alternative? Is there something else that should be done instead?
Brianna, a lot of our questions and concerns from members are practical. Business people understand the first rule of holes. When you find yourself in one, stop digging. And so it isn't exactly an alternative, but part of our message to the Biden-Harris administration and the U.S. Department of Labor is please just stop. Please understand that waiting 2 months after the president announced his intent to establish a federal mandate, announcing it 2 days after the November election to take effect in January, ignores economic reality that for many, many employers and employees, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's are the busiest times of the year. At the same time, private businesses in Michigan are facing labor shortages, supply chain difficulties, rising inflation. This rule is unnecessary. It may soon be obsolete as the fight against COVID evolves. And we're concerned that, frankly, it will do more harm than good. Many of us have worked with Governor Whitmer as members of the Protect Michigan Coalition, myself included. And as Andy indicated earlier, we are pro-vaccine. A lot of us have spent a lot of time and effort trying to educate and inform and persuade employees and employers. One of the ironies of this rule, I agree with Andy and James, this is likely to make a bad situation worse in terms of labor shortage, and Mike has spoken to that directly, and it relies on a fourfold increase in the availability of tests and people taking tests, and there are real world questions about whether these tests are available, affordable, will they be accurate and timely. This regulation, frankly, seems like an impossible dream by someone who's sitting in an office in the Labor Department inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C.
Hey, Rich, can I add a little bit to that? Because you did a great job there. A couple of other things, Brianna. That forcing us to have a test monitored is also a very undue burden. If employers could require testing and that testing could be done in the privacy of that person's home or wherever they want to go get tested, and all they have to do is supply a test result that doesn't have to be observed by someone either via Zoom or an in-person observation, that is an absolutely undue burden. There is no provision for people who have already have COVID and, can prove that they've had COVID. And the other thing that I think is really short-sighted on this is just anecdotal because it's only people that I know. But I can tell you that almost 100% of the people I know that have contracted COVID in the last 2 months are all fully vaccinated. And they've probably spread it to people who are fully vaccinated, and they probably got it from people who are fully vaccinated. So this is the new reality. And we all know, I haven't been able to find the published statistics because I don't think they really want us to find it, on how much of the spread is now coming from fully vaccinated people. So if the spread is going to continue on from fully vaccinated people, this whole thing is ill-conceived.
And again, I don't think this can be said enough. The most broad, far-reaching, complicated rule OSHA has ever put forward, right? That's what we're talking about here and trying to deal with. I mean, the things in this 490-page rule are complex. We're having, employers are going to be responsible for keeping track of all the different testing, enforcing a mask mandate on unvaccinated individuals. It just goes on. And that's why we need to push back. That's why we want them to reconsider.
Andy, I think that's a great place to stop. It doesn't look like we have any further questions from the press. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. If you would like to talk to any of us offline, you may get in contact with John Selleck at Harbor Strategies, and he will facilitate that for you. Thanks again for your time today, and we'll talk soon.